Japan is a land of many ghost tales and urban legends. What follows is a story I wrote based on one of those urban legends, that of the Kuchi-sake Onna. I hope you enjoy it.
Another Friday night on the outskirts of Nagoya, Japan. Philip found himself drinking yet again at Tanaka's Sports Bar. Yes, a Japanese drinking establishment called Tanaka's Sports Bar. The name was a deliberate marketing ploy to draw the Gaijin clientele, and it worked. On any given night, a dozen or so foreigners crowded the tiny space. The mostly British and American expats liked to exchange stories about life in Japan and the many idiosyncrasies of the Japanese. Tonight, their conversation had turned to Japanese urban legends. Before coming to Japan to teach English 2 years ago, Philip had believed that Japan was all bullet trains, robots, and gleaming skyscrapers. He was surprised to learn how haunted this country was, if you believed the local legends, that was. Tonight, someone had brought up the legend of the Kuchi-sake Onna, or slit-mouthed woman. The bartender, Suzuki, joined in the conversation. Suzuki had spent much of his childhood in the United States, where his father was a Toyota executive. Suzuki spoke excellent English, with only a trace of an accent. This was a good thing because few of the foreigners who frequented Tanaka's sports bar spoke more than survival Japanese. They say that the Kuchi-sake Onna was the wife or mistress of a samurai, Suzuki explained now. But she was unfaithful, or so her samurai husband believed, and so he slit her mouth from ear to ear. There were some flinches and cringes at this detail. It was so horrible. How could someone do that to a woman? That would have killed her, right? Philip asked. He was sitting at the bar finishing his fourth drink for the night. Philip was feeling a little woozy. He should have stopped at 3 or maybe even 2. Oh yes, Suzuki said. Of course it killed her, but she came back as a ghost. Of course she came back as a ghost, Philip said. And then what? Well, Suzuki said, like a lot of Japanese ghosts who come back that way, the Kuchi-sake Onna is always in a vengeful mood. You don't want to run into her. Philip would later reflect that he could have dropped the subject right then and there, but he was genuinely curious. If pressed, he might have also admitted that he was eager to prove himself unafraid of Japanese ghosts. He wasn't another fearful gaijin who became easily spooked by Japanese urban legends. Why wouldn't I want to run into her? Philip asked. I mean, other than the fact that she's a ghost. Because she might impale you with the long metal shears she said to carry. Or she might cut your mouth from ear to ear, so you'll be just like her. It all depends on how you answer her question. Maybe we shouldn't talk about this, said a young man seated at the bar next to Philip. He was a new guy whom Philip had seen around a little but didn't really know. He was from Ohio or Indiana, one of those flyover states, and he was still awestruck by practically everything in Japan. He's got a point, Suzuki said. If you talk about the Kuchi-sake Onna, you might accidentally summon her. That's the way it works with a lot of the ghosts over here. If you become interested in them, they become interested in you. I'll take my chances, Philip said. Tell me more. Well, Suzuki said, she usually appears as a beautiful woman wearing a face mask, like the kind that so many Japanese people wear during flu season. So you can't see her cut mouth then, Philip reasoned. Yes, Suzuki affirmed. That's the idea. Then what? Then she asks you if you think she's beautiful. Rather conceited of her, Philip said. This brought a titter of laughter from several men seated at the bar. They were all listening now, even the new guy from the Midwest who seemed to be afraid. Suzuki told the rest of the story regarding the Kuchi-sake Onna and what might happen if you ran into her. If you encounter the Kuchi-sake Onna, don't answer her, Suzuki concluded, drawing a beer from the tap behind the bar. So what does one do then, Philip asked, if confronted by this Kuchi-sake Onna, this slit-mouthed woman? Suzuki turned around and placed the beer on the bar. Then he said, there is nothing you can do if you meet her, so the only way is to avoid her. And how do I do that? Philip asked. Don't walk alone at night, Suzuki said, and especially not when you've been thinking about women, because this draws the Kuchi-sake Onna to you like… Suzuki paused to think of the English expression he wanted. Like a moth to a flame. Philip didn't know what to say to that. He was 28 years old and women were never far from his mind. He realized now that he really had imbibed too much. He pulled out his wallet and counted out the yen notes needed to pay his tab for the night. Suzuki caught the visual cue and produced his bill. If I see this Kuchi-sake Onna, I'll just run away from her, Philip said. Suzuki laughed without humor. Good luck with that. She can change her location at will. Oh, and one more thing about her. She often appears to be very tall. Tall like a giant? Philip asked. No, but much taller than an ordinary woman, or even most men. Philip realized that he was toying with Suzuki now, just as he believed, on some level, that Suzuki was only toying with him. This was a game that the Japanese sometimes played with foreigners. See how gullible they were. Suzuki, moreover, had lived in America, so he had absorbed American sarcasm. Sometimes it was okay to play the game in reverse. Let the Japanese believe that you were totally lost in their world, even if you saw and understood more than you let on. But Suzuki's expression became suddenly serious. Take a taxi, he said. This late at night, you shouldn't be out walking the streets by yourself. It's too dangerous. I'll consider your suggestion, Philip replied. He didn't want to be rude to Suzuki, but he didn't want to play the role of naive foreigner either. Several of Philip's expatriate friends bade him farewell as he departed. At least one cautioned him to watch out for that woman with the cut mouth. She'll rip your guts out with those shears of hers, someone shouted, or she'll cut your mouth from ear to ear. Once outside the bar, Philip felt a little lightheaded. The September night was pleasantly cool. He stopped and pulled out his wallet. He didn't believe, of course, that he needed to take a taxi in order to avoid a Japanese ghost. But he was moderately intoxicated, and he faced a long walk back to his apartment. Maybe he should splurge on a taxi. He had plenty of cash with him, after all. But it would be a shame to blow money on a ride when he could make it home on foot in less than a half hour. And he had another idea. I can take a shortcut, he decided. Earlier this week, he had been using Google Maps to study the area of Nagoya that comprised his usual range of activity. He had discovered a shortcut between Tanaka's sports bar and his apartment building. All he had to do was walk through some residential neighborhoods. He remembered Suzuki's warning about walking alone at night. Japan was one of the safest countries in the world. It was almost impossible to get mugged here. Nor did he believe in Japanese ghosts who carried blades and asked strange questions. Philip, moreover, was from New Jersey. I'm probably the most dangerous thing within 20 miles, he said to himself as he set off on foot. But the shortcut did not go as planned. He took a wrong turn somewhere. He pulled out his phone and tried to reorient himself, once more referring to Google Maps. But the actual layout of the streets didn't quite match what he saw online. He ended up wandering through an area where none of the buildings were lit up. The neighborhood was neither residential nor industrial exactly, but very run down and quite deserted. Ah, this is no good, Philip said aloud. There was only one thing to do now. He would have to double back. But doubling back wasn't so simple either. Philip found himself at an intersection, and that necessitated a choice. Now, had he passed through this intersection going in the opposite direction? He must have, but he didn't remember it. More importantly, he wasn't sure which way he should turn, or should he continue on a straight trajectory. He looked slowly and methodically in all four directions, trying to get his bearings. The fourth option, to his right, was a small alleyway. The alleyway was dark, but it was not entirely empty. In the dim light of the alley, he spotted a feminine figure. She appeared to be watching him. Hello, Philip asked uncertainly. The Japanese woman stepped out from the shadows, allowing him to get a better look at her. She seemed to grow taller as she moved into the portion of the alley that was partly illuminated by a nearby security light. This had to be an optical illusion. Finally, she seemed to stop growing, and Philip assessed her full height. She was unusually tall, especially for a Japanese woman. The woman in the alleyway looked tall enough to play for the NBA. Other than that, she was beautiful. She had long, straight black hair and alabaster skin, but the bottom half of her face was covered. She was wearing a mask, like so many Japanese wore during flu and cold season, like the whole world had worn during the pandemic of a few years ago. She was wearing a mask, just like... No, it couldn't be. The woman narrowed her eyes at Philip. He was already disturbed by her unusual appearance, but now a sudden chill ran through him. Hello, he repeated. Am I beautiful? She said. Her voice was high and sweet and not quite there, like the ringing of a distant wind chime. But there was no mistaking her words. Am I beautiful? In her hands was a pair of blades, oversized shears. Everything that Suzuki had told him, warned him about, came rushing back to him. Am I beautiful? She pressed. This time her voice was much deeper, almost as deep as a man's. Another detail Suzuki had noted. The ghost's ruined mouth was filled with rows of razor-sharp teeth. Philip could see the outlines of her teeth beneath the mask. He could see them moving up and down, back and forth. Despite his mounting terror, Philip tried to remember the rules, to recall everything he had been told. If you denied her beauty, she killed you with her blades. If you agreed that she was beautiful, the next step would be to lower her mask. Then she would ask you if she was still beautiful. If you replied in the affirmative, she would disfigure you in a similar manner. The Kuchi-sake Onna entrapped her victims with the ultimate catch-22, a lose-lose proposition. She took a step forward as if pressuring him to answer. Then he thought of something, a possible loophole, a way out. You look more or less normal to me, Philip said. I'm not really the world's best judge of beauty. The strange tall woman hesitated and tilted her head at him. His ambiguous response had had the desired effect. He had momentarily confused her, interrupted her pattern. But this reprieve could only be temporary. Philip whirled around and took off in a sprint. He aimed himself in the direction of the next intersection. Maybe he could find help there. He stopped abruptly when the woman appeared, shears in hand, less than 20 feet in front of him. He turned around as if to retrace his steps. Now she was about 20 feet beyond him in that direction. She's rigged the game, Philip thought. Even if I outsmart her, I can't win. In pure desperation, he whirled to his left. Then he saw the taxi. He started running again. He raised both hands and waved wildly at the car. At any moment, he expected to feel the agony of metal shears plunging into his body, or perhaps the tip of the knife that the ghostly woman was also said to carry. But that didn't happen. He reached the taxi, startling the driver somewhat, but securing his escape. Or so he hoped. The taxi driver was a Japanese man with a receding hairline, between 50 and 60 years of age. Eager to get a fare and unafraid of gaijin, he motioned for Philip to get into the back seat of the vehicle. The interior of the taxi was clean, though it smelled of cigarettes. Philip did not care. The driver looked at him questioningly in the rearview mirror. What was wrong, his gaze seemed to say. Kuchi-sake Onna, Philip said. I ran into the Kuchi-sake Onna. The driver's eyes went wide. Oh, he said. Philip would have been hard-pressed to say whether or not the driver believed him, or for that matter, if the driver fully understood him. Philip started to fill in the details to tell the driver what had happened to him. He had to tell someone after all. But the driver's English was clearly not up to the task. When Philip fully grasped this, he shrugged and decided to let it go. The man might or might not have believed him anyway. He rapidly told the driver the address of his apartment building. Let's go, he said. Get us out of here, please. Pedal to the metal. He leaned back against the cushion of the back seat. He should just enjoy the ride to his apartment. He caught a glimpse of movement beside him. He started and jerked his head in the direction of the empty space. There was nothing and no one there. He looked quickly to the front seat, half expecting to see the Kuchi-sake Onna staring at him from the front passenger position. But the middle-aged male driver was the sole occupant of the front of the taxi. It's over now, Philip told himself with great relief. He mostly believed this. When the taxi pulled up in front of his apartment building, Philip thanked the driver, paid him, and gave him a generous tip, which the driver tried to refuse at first. As the taxi pulled away, Philip looked both ways on the sidewalk in front of his apartment building. Once again, he half expected to see that horrible woman. And once again, he was relieved when she did not appear. He made his way up to his apartment on the 3rd floor. He took the stairs rather than the elevator. For one thing, the exercise would do him good. For another thing, he did not want to entrap himself in an enclosed space. If everything went all right from here, he might start riding elevators again in a day or two. He entered his tiny apartment and turned on all the available lighting. He collapsed onto the futon in the middle of the room and tried to analyze what had happened to him tonight. Could he attribute tonight's experience to intoxication? He had had 4 drinks after all, 2 beers and 2 Suntory whiskeys. Not a small amount of alcohol, but not enough alcohol to cause a hallucination like that. The alcohol had, however, fueled his feelings of disorientation, the constant daily strain of existing in a foreign environment, where he didn't know the language and struggled constantly with the customs and culture. The Japanese were polite and hospitable to a fault, but he didn't really belong here. In that moment, Philip came to a conclusion. It was time to go home. 2 years was enough time in Japan. He would go home to New Jersey. No one's idea of heaven on earth, but at least the threats on the nighttime street in New Jersey were knowable. It didn't really happen, Philip said aloud to his empty apartment. He was only 28 years old. He didn't want to go through the rest of his life believing that he had encountered a vengeful ghost in an alleyway in Japan. He didn't want to go through the rest of his life believing that such things existed. He needed sleep. The morning, he decided, would put a different perspective on all of this. Then on Monday morning, he would tell the management of the school where he taught English that he did not plan to renew his annual contract. They would be disappointed. Philip was popular at the school, especially with the female students, but he was not irreplaceable. There was no end to the number of gaijin who were eager to experience Japan for a year or two. He stood briefly and turned out the lights. The room was dark, except for some ambient light from the street outside. Sleep came surprisingly easy. For much of the night, his dreams were few and pleasant. Sometime in the hours before dawn, he awoke. He was not even fully awake before a cold realization gripped him. He was not alone. Someone else was with him in his tiny apartment. He opened his eyes. The woman from the alley was either standing or kneeling over him. She was leaning forward so that her face was less than a foot from his, and she had removed her mask, revealing the horrible gash that the jealous samurai had inflicted on her all those years ago. Her mouth, Philip saw, was full of razor-sharp teeth, just as Suzuki had told him. "Am I beautiful?" she asked.
Well, the lesson of the story is even though Japan has a reputation for being a very safe country, justifiably, you should always be careful when you're out walking alone at night there. If you enjoyed this combination of horror and a Japanese setting, you can find more of the same in my novel Kuwa 6226, available on Amazon. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you again soon.